so this, my friends, this is the StarCitizen 4.0 PvP tier list. Okay, so just so you know, it says 4.0 right here. Okay, you can't get it wrong. And it's a little bit different from the last tier list we did. So we still have the TCS score, which we'll talk about here in a second. We still have the pilot score, which is 1 to 4, which is color coded, but I've also placed a number in the small little box on the top left hand corner of every ship, which I'll explain here in a second. For everybody, you know, that's anxious about this stuff, this is the whole tier list. I'm not going to go through each individual one and hide it from you, because I know a lot of people just, they want to see the tier list and then make it up for themselves. But you have to understand, read the bottom, 3 versus 3 team fighting and gang tier list. Okay, now I want to be very clear when I say this. The reason why we're doing a team fighting and gang tier list is because with master modes the way that it is, a solo by yourself person is no longer able to do the things that you could do because of the change in flight model. So because ships have been pigeonholed into such a specific little spot, your flexibility as a solo pilot has dramatically diminished. So the likelihood of you being successful as a solo pilot in dangerous areas of space like Pyro and so on, it's your success is going to be very low. So what's likely going to happen is that more people will be more, I guess you could say, interested, or the successful groups out there are going to be the groups that go together. And of the groups that go together, these are the ships that are successful in player versus player gang warfare right now in 4.0. Now, obviously, some things are a little bit different from the previous tier list we did in 3.23 and so on, but not a lot has made huge changes. But there's been enough changes that you'll see here has changed some of the ships at the top, right? So for everyone complaining, well, I can solo a Buccaneer in my Hornet and blah, blah, blah. I understand that. But on average, Hornets in groups are losing to groups of Buccaneers and faster interceptor type ships. Okay. So to explain the TCS score, threat is how dangerous is this ship when it is facing towards me, and how likely am I going to survive a trade. So for example, an F8 Lightning has a 10 on the threat score, which means if that F8 Lightning is able to get its guns on me within the ranges it's supposed to be, essentially it's kind of giving you almost like a DPS score, where of its category, of its class, it is extremely dangerous if you get in front of it when it's shooting. So an F8 Lightning would be an example of a very high threat. The C, or control score, is mostly based on how good is that ship at controlling the distance, the turn rates, and the lateral Gs, and how to flip the fight upside down. How easy is it for that ship to control geometrically where you are in the fight? Okay, and then the last score is survivability, which is how long am I expected to survive if things go the wrong way? How long am I expected to survive if I'm getting attacked by multiple people at the same time? Okay, so this has a lot to do with how tanky the ship is, how hard it is, how tough it is to shoot down and kill. But as we can see here, the F8 Lightning is a 10 on threat and a 9 on survivability, except for it has almost no control. So what ends up happening is a lot of times F8 Lightning pilots get into a lot of trouble because the G-forces, turn rate, and the control that the ship has over the fight is so low that small ships like, you know, anything in the SB and A tier is going to be able to get under it and capitalize on the fact that the F8 Lightning has very little control over the fight. Okay, so the best in class The check mark that you see here on the left side of the screen that says best in class, that means that in that tier, that is the best ship in terms of the bang for your buck. It's the most effective ship across the broader spectrum of everything, whereas certain ships in certain tiers are going to be like placed above and below each other. So out of the S tier, for example, the S tier, the Fury, is going to be the most adaptable and the most effective across all the different ships in the game, across all the different situations and scenarios. The Fury will give you the most effect for, I guess you could say, the ships in that category. That does not mean that a team of M50s that are very well coordinated cannot win against Hornets, or sorry, Furies. It's just that the Fury is the best in that category. But the S category means that team fighting ships that are flying any of these three ships are going to be significantly more powerful against ships in lower tiers. Now, I want to preface that an E tier fighter can still shoot down an S tier pilot or S tier fighter. These things happen in fights. But again, on average, over lots of data, this is what I'm seeing out there in the broader, I guess you could say, PvP community. So just so everyone's aware, so nobody gets triggered, the expert, trained, rookie, and beginner stats are something that are a little bit flexible in the sense that how do you know you're an expert, trained, rookie, beginner, whatever? Well, you can tell this. If you're winning fights in a Fury versus Gladiuses, Buccaneers, Blades, Firebirds, all that stuff, and these pilots in the A tier are trained pilots, that means that you're performing at the level to get the most out of that ship. Now, you'll notice here that 1 is expert, 2 is trained, 3 is rookie, 4 is beginner. So a Fury requires, and I want to be very clear with this, requires a trained pilot to be able to get the most out of that platform. The reason I'm saying this is because you have to understand pitch control. You have to understand inverting the circle or lateral Gs and how that affects the rotation of the fight. You have to understand merging. You have to understand basic gunnery and convergence. And you have to understand G-force control so you don't black out. Those 5 things you must know, and you must know well, to be able to get the most out of something like a Fury. If you take a beginner pilot and you put them in a Fury, you will not perform at an S tier level. But it means that after many hours of experience in dogfighting practice, the maximum ceiling that that fighter is capable of getting to is into the S tier. Is everyone crystal clear when I explain that? I want to be as clear as mud. Because there are people who will take these S tier fighters and they will get absolutely destroyed, and they'll say, well, Avenger, your tier list is wrong. Well, this is a polite way of me saying you need more skill sets. You need more time in the seat to get the most out of that ship. An experienced or trained or expert pilot will win fights a lot more often against an experienced or expert Hornet pilot because the limitations of the system are exceeded depending on the ship choice. A Fury has a higher skill ceiling than a Hornet. Is everyone on the same page there? Okay. So I'm always going to rate a fighter based on what its maximum capability is going to be. So that means that a beginner pilot in a Hornet is likely going to get relatively similar results to an expert pilot, but a trained Buccaneer, Gladius, Avenger, you got to be an expert for the Avenger, but a trained Blade pilot, those pilots are going to be winning a lot more against a Hornet because the Hornet has a glass ceiling, and that glass ceiling has a really hard time punching up into the S and A tier fighters. Okay. Now remember, this is a PvP tier list. Okay. So let's get started. Let's go all the way down here to F tier. Oh, poor guys, man. I know some of you folks wanted the Zeus to be a lot better, but I don't know how else to explain this. Large profile, big cross section, low hit points, low damage, low turn rate. So what ends up happening is you become a very easy to kill, very slow pinata that the best you're hoping for is able to trade against some of these other ships, you know? So if you're in player versus player and you're in a Zeus, the only suggestion I can give to you is run. Run as fast as you can, hit it into nav mode, drop your chaff, and just get out of there. Because even an experienced pilot in a Zeus is going to have a very miserable time. Okay? The Sulin is the same kind of thing. Ironically enough, the Sulin, we've had better results. The Sulin actually does shoot down the Zeus a lot more than the Zeus shoots down the Sulin. Talking about skill sets. But again, in order for you to be able to get the maximum out of something like a Sulin, you've got to be trained. The way the ship handles, the way the ship takes off, the way the ship's control is, the way the turn rate, all that stuff. You need to be a trained pilot to get the most out of it. E tier, I know some people are going to get really upset with this, but I put the Guardian like strongly in E tier because large profile, relatively low G-forces, pretty good DPS. Like, you got to respect the 2 size 5s. But again, TCS, what's the control score? 3. We did multiple fights and lots of testing, and the Guardian lost to the F8 Lightning on turn rate, on all kinds of stuff. So if you're experienced pilot on both ships, you're not winning fights in the Guardian. And it's a real shame. But again, this is a player versus player metric, right? But the Guardian right now is considerably underperforming. And it's exactly how I told you guys. Look at up here, we have S tier Fury, and down here we have an E tier. And the only real big change between these two ships is the physical size has a dramatic impact on whether a ship is successful in a fight, and the overall top speed, which again has a huge impact on success in a fight. So right here we have a Fury in S tier and its bigger brother in E tier. There's a huge divide here, and I can't use a better example of two ships that are almost identical in design, but because of the geometric issues with the StarCitizen's flight model and ranges, weapon speeds, all that stuff, we see a very clear divide between effective ships in PvP and ships that are not. Okay? Then we have the Pisces, same kind of thing. Although the Pisces has a bit more control, it just doesn't have a lot of guns. Although I have been successful shooting down some of these ships in E tier. But don't take a Pisces against anything that's actually combat. But you could definitely kill use a Pisces to kill any ships in F tier. The C1 or the A1, I put the A1 in here because it is a bomber. It's a military ship, so it should be able to engage. Again, not going to be winning fights against anything in D tier, but it looks cool. It sounds nice, but it performs like trash in PvP. If you're in a bomber, just expect yourself to, if you're getting engaged by fighters, don't even try to fight them. Pop your chaff, go into nav mode, and GTFO. Do not fight in an A2. You will die, right? Eclipse, same thing. But again, the Eclipse, we're basing the Eclipse on other fighters. An Eclipse is a 10 out of 10 threat against large capital ships. In my opinion, the Eclipse is kind of where it needs to be. It's not a dogfighter. It's a stealth ship. It's not meant to fight other ships. It's meant to get in quietly, drop its payload, do a huge amount of damage to a target, and then make its way off the field. That's exactly where I think the Eclipse should be. So I'm not really upset about the Eclipse being a pretty terrible dogfighter. You can make the same argument about the Ion and the Inferno, except for the Ion and the Inferno's overall DPS is lower than something like a Hornet and F8 Lightning. So if you're going to make a size 7 gun ship that's basically a gun DPS, you've got to upgrade the weapons. The DPS on the Ion is anemic. It's quite embarrassing. Then you have the Vanguard, same thing. Vanguard actually, ironically enough, does more DPS if it's fit a certain way than the Ion. So definitely something wrong with the decisions, I guess you could say, with what happens at the Starfighter. And then last, to fill up the list here, we have the Cutter. Now, some of you probably thinking, haha, Cutter, there's no way that my Cutter is going to be able to, beat a Zeus. Yeah, if you look here, if you can be a rookie, as long as you go into VTOL mode and get close, you can easily outmaneuver and kill a Zeus. It does take time, but it's a very winnable fight. And ironically enough, the Cutter does have a chance against killing Zeuses and Sulins. So you might be sleeping on the cutter, but, you know, don't knock it until you actually get out there fighting one. But again, you've got to be at least a rookie. You've got to have some basic understanding of combat. Then we go up to D tier. Again, you can be a rookie pilot in something like a Hurricane. And again, we are basing this off of 2 pilots. So a gunner and a pilot, okay? And even with a double-man ship in a team environment, again, right? 3v3, like lots of people together, that Hurricane is still suffering. Because this, again, top speed, profile, all that stuff, it comes into account. The Hurricane is just simply not winning fights. It's too big, it's too slow, it's not able to mitigate its damage, and it's not fast enough to force damage upon other ships. So it ends up getting surrounded and murdered, and unfortunately, our Hurricane is still in D tier. Then you have a 2-man Gladiator, which is again suffering from almost the exact same problem that the Hurricane has, except for it's slightly smaller and slightly more maneuverable. But again, very low top speed, low acceleration. So it's kind of floundering around in D tier. Although the Gladiator with size 5 torpedoes, if you can dumbfire them, can be exceptionally effective within reason. Not as much as an Eclipse, so you might as well bring an Eclipse because the Eclipse does significantly more damage, by orders of magnitude more. But the Gladiator can still be a relatively viable option if you're attacking bigger ships. But only if you dumbfire those torpedoes. Then we got the Cuddy Blue. I put the Cuddy Blue under trained because a Cuddy Blue is not an easy ship to fly. You got to know how to, manage your VTOL modes. You got to be able to understand where you are relative to your speed walls, because again, master modes forces us into this like small little funnel, and you got to know where you are inside that imaginary, I guess you could say, cone. So you really have to have a good sense of what your 3-dimensional movement looks like while the fight is happening, which is really, really difficult. But again, as you become trained, that will become second nature. But you've got to be at that level to get the most out of the Cuddy Blue. And then even then, you're still losing fights to all these ships above. Santok guy, same kind of thing. Large, slow, good weapons, but it gets surrounded and murdered. So it doesn't have any ability to push its damage out. It's so large that you can hit it from kilometers and kilometers away, right? So then we have the Mustangs, which ironically enough performed a lot worse than I thought. I thought the Mustangs would be at least C tier, but the best way I can explain it is it's a small ship that's too slow. It's just too slow, right? It's easy to kill, doesn't take a lot of hits, and its starboard and port side engines break off at really the first sign of trouble. And so what ends up happening is, even if you do about 10 or 20% of what actual damage it can take, once you lose that engine, fight's over. So you're basically screwed. Aurora, in my opinion, does better, but again, in that same category. Small, super easy to kill, doesn't have a lot of G-forces. It's not like the old flight model where you could actually manage things. Now we're all fighting inside a phone booth, and so it doesn't have anywhere else to go except for a tank damage. And if it tanks damage, I mean, it's basically a space coffin, right? Finally, wrapping up D tier, we have the Tana. Man, what do I say about the Tana? Physically quite large, slow. Even if you VTOL and try to move around, the likelihood of you being able to avoid fire is very low as well. And all the weapons you can put on that thing, it doesn't make up for the fact that it's so easy to kill. It's so easy to kill. It has like nowhere close to the hit points it needs or speed that it needs to be able to mitigate any damage. So you just end up getting surrounded and murdered. Then we go up to C tier. Again, the Arrow went from, high A tier, almost S tier in the previous flight model to C tier. The Arrow has dropped almost 4x its position from the previous flight model, and a lot of things have to do with this. Even at an expert level, the Arrow is losing fights to all these ships up in A, B, and C, SAB. It's unfortunate, but that's the reality we live in. It's got a sluggish nose. It's hard to keep on target. It's not responsive. It's actually slower than all the other light fighters, which is crazy because it's advertised as being the fastest. Its weapon loadout is now less than the Gladius. So it actually has more guns, but less DPS somehow. And also, it's only got one shield, so it dies super quick. And its hull hit points are hilariously low. So you've got everything working against you in the arrow, and even still, the arrow is still able to beat all those ships below it because the arrow is so much tinier and so much easier to able to move around it. But as soon as something is at the same size and faster, the arrow just absolutely falls apart. In team fights, the arrow doesn't really do as well as we thought it would, which is a real shame. And it's not fast enough to be able to mitigate damage against the medium fighters and other ships. So the arrow has, even though it's best in class between all these ships in C tier here, it's still, floundering, I guess you could say. It's absolutely horrendous what they've done to it. 85X, slow, cumbersome, fighter tuned, so it can't really disengage, and it only has 4 size 1s, which don't really have a lot of power. So we haven't found that the 85X is having much luck. It dies super fast. I mean, if you put any damage on it, it just gone, evaporates. But even still, the 85X with a good pilot is going to be able to beat all these ships below it, which is saying something. But again, notice a trend. As we go higher in effectiveness, the ships get smaller. Like, start to notice this. As we become higher in effectiveness, the ships get smaller. Okay. Then we have the Intrepid, which, we talked about the F8 Lightning. Again, right, at length. We know what the issue with the F8 Lightning is. Too big, too slow, no control, lots of damage, but you can't bring that damage to the fight. Then you have the Intrepid, which, ironically enough, during my internal testing and other stuff out there in the persistent universe, the Intrepid did a lot better than I thought. I was expecting the Intrepid to be absolutely horrendous, but for a rookie ship, it's doing better than the Mustang. It's doing better than the Aurora. It's doing better than a lot of the beginner, I guess you could say, ships. It looks like a bag of hammers. I wouldn't suggest buying one for looks. I think it looks terrible, but it's all right. It's like, I was pleasantly happy with how not shitty it was, but it's still a rookie ship, so take it with a grain of salt. Then you have the Hawk. Again, Hawk, brittle. It breaks easy. A lot of components fall off the ship. The ship cuts in half at like the first sign of damage, so you're not really surviving many fights. It has a good weapon loadout, but what point is having a good weapon loadout if the ship is large, cumbersome, and very brittle? The Hawk used to be something that I loved to fly in the old model, and now it's mostly something I avoid because there's just so many problems with it. If you're a rookie pilot, you can still get something out of it. It's got a large signature, so you're likely going to get missiled to the ground, especially if you start turning on your EMP. So, in my opinion, don't fly it if you have no other choice. But if that's all you got, then try to do the best. But again, if you come across any of these ships in S, A, and B tier, try to avoid the fight because it's likely you're going to lose that fight. Then you got the Glaive. Glaive, not my favorite ship. Good damage. Out of the, I guess you could say, heavy attack fighters, it's not terrible. It's better than an Ion, and it's better than a Vanguard. So if you're going to bring a ship with 2 size 5s to bring some damage to the table, you're probably going to want to bring a Glaive, right? And I'd bring a Glaive over a Guardian all day. Then we have the Mantis. So the Mantis is one of those ships that it's only got 2 size 3s. It's pretty brittle, but at the very least, it's fast. So she's got the speed where it counts. In player versus player environments, whatever interdiction ship is holding people to the grid is going to be public enemy number 1. And the nice part about the Mantis is it's interceptor tuned. So it's able to mitigate damage. It's able to get away from fighter screens to some degree. It's one of the only ships, in my opinion, in PvP that's effective for the job that it's supposed to do within reason. The missile system causes all kinds of problems for Mantis pilots. If there's a Mantis on grid, just start shooting missiles at it. It's going to make it miserable. But a Mantis will survive longer and be more effective in stopping people from warping out of the fight than any other ship in the game, including the Mirai QED Guardian and the Antares, all that stuff. Mantises, in my opinion, are the only ship in PvP that is, I guess you could say, doing what it's supposed to do within a tolerance. Then we have the Nomad, which I thought was quite funny because the Nomad, as a starter ship, it's like the Cybertruck of Star Citizen. Ironically enough, 3 size 1 shields, 3 size 3 guns, pretty good power plant, relatively okay thrust, so it has some control over fights, and it's got, I guess you could say, almost fighter level speeds. So you're not winning fights against anything S, A, and B. But within C tier, if you're a good pilot, if you're trained, again, right, look at the skill check. If you're trained in a Nomad, you can have success against all these ships in C tier and below. But don't expect success against anything B and above. Okay? So pretty impressive, though. Not a bad ship, considering it's kind of an all-rounder, right? Okay, this is where we get into controversy. The Mark II F7A Hornet. Holy smokes. Now, it's the best in class, but what we have found is that the Mark II Hornet, again, large, low acceleration, low top speed, relative to all the ships that are beating the Hornet, okay? Notice, again, as we go up in effectiveness, we go down in size and up in speed. There's a correlation there. And that inflection point is the Mark II Hornet. If the Mark II was 50 to 60 meters per second faster, it would probably go from B tier to high A into S tier almost. If it was any slower, it would be probably even down to the D tier. In my opinion, because all the speeds are so fucked up, we have this crazy disparity in ships where they're supposed to be and what actually is winning fights out there in the persistent universe in groups. So the Mark II Hornet, in my personal opinion, and from what we've seen out there in the PU and our own internal testing against other squadrons, is the Mark II Hornet is extremely dangerous. Again, 9 out of 10 on threat. You got to respect those guns, but it's got a 5 on control. It just cannot control fights like it used to. And so you're stuck with this, you know, like a smaller, you know, slightly better controlling F8 Lightning, but it still suffers from all the problems. If you, again, right, see up here, interceptors, 9 out of 10 control, 8 control, 8 control, 5 control fighter, but it's got a lot of forward-facing guns. We can talk about that later. 9 control, 7 control, 7 control, 9 control, 10 control, 5, right? The reason why it has 5 control is because at any point during this fight, I can choose how and close and how far I want to get. If I'm in an M50, in a Fury, in an Archimedes, I get to decide what happens in the fight. You don't get to tell me when or where I take an engagement. And because we've got such a vast disparity in top speeds and accelerations, that there is no way in a Hornet you're going to force me in something like an M50 Fury and all those other ships to take a fight that I don't want to take, you know? And that is the critical issue with so many problems with flight, is all the ships that have dominance and control are the ones that dominate team fights because you have coordinated ganking. Essentially, the faster, more maneuverable ships decide, I'm going to stay out of range, and then, okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay, you guys see that guy? Yeah. Okay, let's attack together, right? And you know, and this is indicative of a geometric issue because of the way the gunnery system works and all that stuff. Which, if you don't know what I'm talking about, that's okay. The YouTube channel that we have here can explain these, I guess you could say, these phenomena. Right? So the geometric issue is a video that I put out, all that stuff. So 325A, interceptor tuned, high control, high DPS, double shields, pretty good turn rate. The only thing the 325A has going against it is it's physically quite large. But ironically enough, the 325A is quite a good ship, especially if you bring it in a team environment. So good on the 325 series. Sabre. Sabre's a fighter, and it has slightly more speed than the Hornets. But the problem with the Sabres is, again, low hit points. If you get on top of that Sabre, the fight is over. You know, and I find that the acceleration on the Sabre it's really nothing to write home about. But the problem with the Sabre these days is you can exploit the stealth mechanics at the moment. You can get a Sabre down to like 800 to 900 meters per targeting. So when you're out there in the persistent universe, you're looking around and something's firing missiles at you. You can't target it. You can't see it. You can actually pick it up with your own eyeballs kilometers before your sensors pick it up. And that is an exploit with the current signature system that CIG is using. Because if you can physically see a ship, you're telling me that my radar can't see that? That's a problem with the game. But as of right now, you can't target the Saber below like 1,000 meters. So unless you're right on top of it, you're not going to be able to target it. You're not going to be able to see it. And it's going to fire tons of missiles at you, which are likely going to hit because the missile system is broken. That's why the Saber is in B tier, which is unfortunate, right? Then you have the Hornet family. I put all the Hornets and all their variants in B tier. Because whether you're using a tracker Hornet, a ghost Hornet, all these other different variants, they're all relatively the same, and they all kind of behave the same way. Some might have one or two or less guns. One might have slightly more acceleration than the other one. One might have slightly more stealth, blah, blah, blah. But overall, the Hornets are staying, I guess you could say, the Hornet family, the Mark 1s and whatnot, are all kind of low B tier, but I'd take Hornets against any of these ships in C tier or below all day.
If you would join us.
Then you have, ironically enough, a bit of a fall from grace here, the Scorpius. So the Scorpius, with some of the changes that some of these ships have had, the Scorpius has relatively stayed the same. It's just that other ships have become better in the last little bit. So what ends up happening is the Scorpius basically has stayed static, where things have moved around the Scorpius rather than the Scorpius has moved down. Okay, double seat gunners, and you'll notice that out of the double seat heavy fighters, the Hurricane's down at D and the Scorpius is up there in B tier. The Scorpius is genuinely, no joke, a legitimately effective platform. It's just you really got to understand how to fly it. So even in a rookie, you can do all right. But I would highly suggest that you are a trained pilot before you start pulling out Scorpiuses, because you really got to understand the geometric bubble that you're flying in, where your main acceleration zones are, how to roll control, all that stuff. Because a proper use of a Scorpius has everything to do with how it engages and disengages in a team fight. Okay, but again, even with great piloting skills and great mechanics and great situational awareness, you're still going to be losing fights to all these ships in S and A tier. Banner Defender, ironically, quite good. Like, quite surprisingly good. And if you can get the Banu guns to work, the Singes, they shoot at 3,000 meters per second, so they're essentially almost hit scan, except for they have low range. Because if the Banu guns had high range, I mean, there just would be no getting away. So surprisingly not bad, you know, relatively tough, relatively good DPS. It's just kind of like a middle ground. And even though it's quite large, it's actually quite hard to hit when it's facing you. So it's got a bit of a tight profile. But again, don't be bringing it against anything in a higher tier. Cartual. Cartu's a tricky one, guys. And I put it as an expert pilot because in a Cartual, Grogu stop. In a Cartual, you have to have really good awareness as to where you have to deflect. Now, you have strong thrusters, some of the strongest in the game, and you can move in all these different directions. But the problem I find with the Cartual is it still follows the same mechanics like all the other ships do. You still have to bank into your turns and catch targets, but you can kind of basically move left and right. You can exploit the wiggle on the Cartual almost better than any other ship. And so even if you're facing it at like 400 meters, it's just moving in these weird jagged movements that just mess with people's heads. And if you're really good, you know, okay, I got a guy moving up here to my top left. That means relative to him, I'm going to move up because that's going to be 90 degrees from his location. So you got to move up, and then against that guy, okay, I'm going to move this way. If you can really understand that geometric movement, using a Cartual just makes life super miserable for so many people trying to fight it. But you've got to be really good. You've got to be really good to get that thing to work. And even still, you're going to lose all your fights to S and A tier ships. It's just, that's the way it goes. Then you got the Talon, which ironically enough is one of those ships that could be really good, but again, doesn't have the top speed and doesn't have the durability to really make it into the A and S tier. It's just too slow. It's just too slow. It's nice. It's fun. It's got a good turn rate. It's got some pretty good guns. Not so bad, but it just doesn't have the control that it needs. It's almost into that A tier. And ironically enough, I'm so blown away that it wasn't listed as an interceptor, considering it's basically a stealth interceptor type ship. But that's the world we live in, right? And then finally wrapping up the B tier list is the 125A. Now, people are probably thinking, why is the 125A here? Well, I'll tell you why. The 125A has a fighter turn rate with interceptor tuning, 2 size 3 guns, and a low profile. The only thing it doesn't have is its signature is quite high, and it's made of paper. It's so brittle. But the nice thing is, and I put this under expert pilot, because to get the most out of a 125A, you have to be very, very skilled. You have to be very aware of where your position is relative to your enemy and be able to guide yourself in, because if you can outturn Hornets, you can outturn all kinds of ships, and you still have the top speed as an interceptor to be able to manage the fight. It's really quite an incredible platform. They must have missed something or messed something up, because there's no way they intentionally put the turn rate of this thing so high, because it's a straight up interceptor with fighter tuning, which I find quite ironic, because as a pilot in Master Modes, there's very few ships I enjoy flying because the game's just terrible for movement. But the 125A is actually in one of those ship categories where I'm genuinely impressed with how it performs. And I think you will be too. But again, if you're not an expert pilot, don't expect to be doing really well in the 125A. But if you are, you're getting to that level, you're trained, you can expect to do very well in the 125A. Okay, so let's wrap it up in A and S tier, guys. These are what you're most likely going to see in Pyro and in the game in general. If it's an A and S tier fighter, it's most likely going to be out there getting into fights. You're most likely, in my opinion, if you're going to be successful in team fights or in PvP in StarCitizen, going to be either fighting or using any ships in the A and S tier. Okay? Now, I want to be very clear here. It does not mean that there are some ships that do better against other combinations. For example, Buccaneers struggle against killing Gladiuses, but again, they're in the same category. But a Buccaneer fleet of teamed coordinated Buccaneers is no problem killing Hornets, 325As, and all these other ships in these categories. It really does make the difference. So I, ironically enough, hated the Buccaneer for a long time. But what's nice about the Buccaneer is it's actually relatively small for the tremendous amount of damage that it outputs. It has Hornet damage with a small profile and interceptor tuning and high G-forces. So it's got good G-force, it's got good control, it's got great handling relative to other ships in its categories. Well, I wouldn't say great handling, but handling to the point where it's able to mitigate damage by extending fights for high Gs, closing distance when it needs to, and its turn rate is high enough, and again, high enough to get guns on target before it makes its way out of the fight. So groups of Buccaneers are extremely effective. If you were to imagine interceptors as their own fighter category, the Buccaneer would be like the heavy fighter of the interceptor category, right? Then you have the Gladius, which has been buffed and buffed and buffed and buffed and buffed for like every frickin' patch now, to the point where the Gladius has become just the ultimate Giga Chad. It's got complete control over its strafe axes. It's got crazy low jerk profile, which means the ship is hyper responsive. 3 size 3 guns, 2 size 1 shields, low signature, high speed. They keep buffing its speed to 520 now. But again, the problem is it's still not fast enough to mitigate everything above it in the S category, right? So even though the Gladius is doing much better and it's an A tier fighter, no doubt about it, it's still not winning fights against M50s, Furies, Archimedes, and it's still losing fights to ships within A tier, depending on the skill of the pilot and what how many people are on what team and so on and so forth. But the Gladius is very solidly in A tier. Then you have the Avenger Warlock. Now, some people are going to freak out. They're going to be like, the Avenger Warlock is an A tier. Okay, 2 reasons. 1, EMP is quite effective. 2, it's got the same gun loadout as the 325A, but the lateral G-forces for the Avenger Titan and Warlocks are quite good, which means it can deflect relative to who's attacking it, and its top speed is interceptor tuned, so it can get out of areas where it's in danger. Now, it may not do as well against the Gladiuses, but it sure as hell beats the pants off of other ships in B tier. So again, within A tier, they're always best in class ships. Personally, for me, I think the best bang for your buck is a Buccaneer, but look at the skill set. You have to be highly trained to be able to get the most out of that platform. If you're a beginner or a rookie and you're using a Buccaneer, you're going to die. If you're a beginner or a rookie and you're using a Buccaneer, you are going to die. Okay? Just because you see it happen on stream doesn't mean that you can do it. It takes time. It's very difficult. It's not easy to do. But if you stick with it and you learn the ropes and you become a better pilot, you will be able to get really good success from Buccaneers, Gladiuses, and so on and so forth. Okay? Then we have the Blade, which, I mean, how do I say it this way? The Blade is basically a almost better Gladius. But there's a problem with the glaive right now, and we saw it during the Enter Atmosphere tournament and stuff. There's a problem with the Blade where if you aim at the blade while it's pushing up, the point of impact is actually below the physical shape of the ship. So what ends up happening is all the blade has to do is strafe just a little bit up, and all your shots will go just below its chin. And that is a problem with the way CIG has put its, I guess you could say, placement of hits, because you can just look at your target and just strafe and roll away, and all your shots will just pass right past the ship. So unfortunately, it's a problem with the old design of the blade that didn't translate well into master modes, but it's something that CIG is going to have to deal with. But low profile, small, has a broken hitbox, so it's a very difficult ship to fight. It's not really that great to fly, so you don't see a lot of them out there in the persistent universe. But if you're a good pilot in a blade, it just makes life miserable, right? Then you have the Firebird and the Raven. So you'll notice there's a difference between the Firebird and the Raven. Okay, they're both the same platform. They both have interceptor tuning. They both have very high speeds. They both have 2 size 3 guns. The difference is the Raven has double EMPs, whereas the Firebird has 24 size 3 EM missiles. So what ends up happening is actual skilled pilots will be able to get the most out of the the Raven, because you actually have to get close. You have to apply damage with guns to get the shields down and then pop the EMPs. You have to have good range control, good geometric control, good G-force control, good ship control, all those things in spades. But if you have all those things, because you're a trained pilot, you can do very well in a Raven. Except for you don't see a lot of them because they're not very common ships, but they are very effective. But again, you've got to be good. A Firebird, not so much. As long as you're within about 5 kilometers of your target, if you're within 5 kilometers and you can keep your nose on a target at 5 kilometers, you can fire EM missiles until the cows come home. And unfortunately right now, with the signature system and how jank and messed up it is, missiles have a very, very high hit ratio. So when those missiles start flying, the chance of you applying 1 or 2 of those EM missiles per volley, which can fire in groups of 6, is very high. It's and only 1 or 2 size 3 EM missiles, when they strike, can cripple or destroy fighters. So even if not all of them hit, only 1 or 2 of them hit, you can actually destroy people's power plants and other components, so that follow-up shots make it almost impossible for them to avoid because their ship's crippled. The Firebird is everything wrong with StarCitizen's combat is exemplified in the Firebird. And a lot of folks bring the Firebird out because it requires no training, no flight control, no merging, no knowledge of geometry, no G-force discipline, no control, and no teamwork coordination to be highly, highly effective. If you want something on grid that has no issue getting someone involved in PvP, you bring the Firebird, because all the hard work is done by the broken missile system, and thus we have the Firebird, right? And just like that, I bought 20 Firebirds. And then finally, to wrap up, the A tier is the Razor. The Razor is tiny, fast, maneuverable, but low damage. So in my opinion, the Razor is a really, really fun fighter platform, but it's it's a racer. But in reality, we talked about the Titan. In reality, the Razor is a great option, low signature, really fun. It's basically a bee swarm type ship. If you get 2 or 3 of them together, that's 2 or 3 size 2 guns. That's 6 size 2 guns on target. That's still a decent amount of firepower. And people need to understand too, if you're working in groups, it's not just one person shooting at a ship. And it doesn't take that long to get a kill when multiple shooters are engaging somebody, right? So you've got to be an expert pilot, because if you make any mistakes in a Razor, you will die. But if you're an expert pilot and you want something to fly that's going to push you to the next level, the maximum potential or maximum ceiling that you can get to in a Razor is very high. But you got to be very, very good. And then finally, folks, S tier. And for a while I was kind of going back and forth on some of these. I thought, maybe they're 8s here, this and that. We did our own testing against other squadrons, other PvP crews, internally within ourselves, and we got the same result every time. The Gang of Furies is absolutely ridiculous. The Fury is so far into the S tier, it's almost S plus tier. It's ridiculous. It's tiny. It's tough as nails. It has insane control. It's got 4 size 2 guns, where if you have a group of Furies, if you think about it, 4 size 2 guns times 3 ships, that's a lot of guns, okay? 4 size 2 guns does a pretty good... I can solo kill a Hornet with 4 size 2 guns pretty quickly. It's really impressive to see how well the Fury does, if there was ever a ship designed to be the epitome of space combat, the Fury would be an example. It's a super tight package, very small, very fast, high acceleration, strong lateral Gs, decent weapon loadout, and ironically enough, it's quite tough. Because the very few times where you are going to apply damage, it's mostly going to be absorbed by the shield, or it'll just bounce off the side of the ship. So the Fury went from being honestly the biggest joke when it first came out to being the absolute epitome of dogfighting potential that this game probably has ever seen in team fighting. There's only 2 ships that come close or can mitigate that kind of behavior, and that is the M50, because the M50 has really strong turn rate for being an interceptor class, extremely high speeds, good lateral Gs, very tiny profile. It's actually smaller than the Fury when you look at it front on, so it's an even tighter, smaller platform, but it's only got 2 size 2s, whereas the Fury has double the DPS, right? I personally love the M50. It's the only one in the S tier category that has a quantum drive. So understand that for a minute. It's the only non-snub fighter that has a quantum drive. So M50s can go around together as packs, whereas Archimedes and Furies have to be carted to the fight. But if you bring a Polaris and you bring a bunch of Furies, there ain't nothing beating that if you've got trained pilots, other than more Furies or potentially M50s and other stuff. And then last, you have my absolute favorite, the Archimedes from Kruger Dynamics. I didn't put the Merlin on here because it would probably be down there in 8s here. I love the Archimedes. I absolutely love the Archimedes. It's basically the Viper from Battlestar Galactica if it had a big nose on it. 4 size 1 guns, you put NDB repeaters on that thing, those size 1 guns are a lot more threatening than people give them credit for. I do this on stream all the time. The Archimedes absolutely destroys people. And if you don't believe me, come to stream and watch it for yourself, guys, because holy smokes does the Archimedes slap. And when you have a coordinated team of people who are trained and are expert pilots, the Archimedes is, in my opinion, the epitome of what master modes, I guess you could say, potential can be. But again, you have to have them carted around. They're carrier-based platforms. They have no quantum drives. So you need to understand when and where you can deploy them. They're not easily deployable. There's lots of problems and bugs with hangars and all kinds of stuff. But if it's all working and you can get one to the field and you can get something to fight,
if you would join us.
The Archimedes is a phenomenal platform. Super strong, super maneuverable, super tiny, and super fun. So I would highly suggest that for you folks out there that are kind of getting to that point where you want to fly something more spicy, or you're kind of getting bored of flying Hornets or other stuff, go get yourself an Archimedes and start dancing with that thing, because holy smokes does the Archimedes slap. It's a ton of fun to fly too. But guys, there you have it. These are what's winning in fights right now. These are the ships that are effective. These are the ones that are, I guess you could say, in reality winning fights, whereas CIG wants to, CIG wants to imagine that the Hurricane has a chance in actual dogfights, and I laugh the Hurricane out the door, which is really a shame, but it is what it is, right? I hope you had some fun today watching the combat, and feel free to ask your questions, guys. My Discord is always open. We are here in AVS a resource for you folks in the community, so please come in with your questions. If you want to learn, you want to get better, this is the place to do it. We're here for you guys. We're a resource for you guys, so please use it, right? I love you all. Thank you so much. I was Avenger One for the Empire.